Why do some people have an orange on their Seder plate? The most common telling of the story, the reason for this, is that Dr. Susanna Heschel was giving a lecture in Miami Beach, and a man angrily stood up to denounce feminism and said a woman belongs on the bima the same way that an orange belongs on the Seder plate. And so to support women belonging on the bima, people started to put an orange on the Seder plate. And that's a really interesting story, an important story, and it's also totally untrue. The real story is similar but different, and different in some very important ways. And Heschel herself explains this in a book that she wrote in 2003. She was actually at Hillel at Oberlin College in the early 1980s. And while she was there, she came across a Haggadah that was written by some of the students to bring a feminist voice into the festival of Pesach. And in this Haggadah, there is a story written, the students wrote the story, about a young girl who asks a Rebbe what room is there in Judaism for a lesbian. And the Rebbe rises in anger and shouts, "There's as much room for a lesbian in Judaism as there is for a crust of bread on the Seder table." And so Heschel was really inspired by this story, but she didn't want to follow it literally, because if she put a crust of bread on her Seder plate in support of lesbians in particular, then that would make everything, the entire table, unkosher for Passover. And that would mean that lesbians were in violation of Judaism itself, and that they were infecting Judaism with something impure, and that would be a very terrible message. So the next year she decides, to put an orange on her family's Seder plate. And she wrote, "I chose an orange because it suggests the fruitfulness for all Jews when lesbians and gay men are contributing and active members of Jewish life." And so that symbolism actually expanded to include all people who feel marginalized from the Jewish community, the widow, the orphan, women in general. But at the core was always solidarity with gay and lesbian Jews. And it wasn't a navel orange. It had to have seeds to symbolize rebirth and regrowth. And it was eaten. And there was a spitting out of seeds to show the spitting out, to remind us of the spitting out, the hatred, the ostracization of gay people from communities, and indeed others who feel the sting of prejudice. And the orange is segmented, not fragmented, because communities may have discrete segments, but they all form a whole nonetheless. So the symbolism of the orange expanded, but clearly it set itself up, Dr. Susanna Heschel set it up as a symbol of liberation, a liberation from that painful place of oppression. And so you may have an orange on your Seder plate this year, you may not. It's up to you. I remember when I was very young, I remember sitting in my grandfather's Seder, and it was a very long, very traditional Seder, and it used what we would call the Maxwell House Haggadah, and it used the traditional Orthodox text. And he would not miss a word, and that was really important. And it's interesting to me that there is a set order of the Seder. That's why it's called Seder. Seder means order. Same as it comes from the same root as Siddur, which is the order of prayers. The Seder is the order of the meal and the order of the rituals around the meal. And so there is a set order of what we do. It's just we're actually free to express that, to explain it in many different ways, to experience it in many different ways. We're not bound by a particular text. And I think back, for example, to the Haggadah when I was a child. This is actually the literal Haggadah I used when I was a child. And it's the children's Haggadah. And to keep children amused, it even had little pop-ups. And you would pull the pop-ups in this one. The Egyptians are drowning. And look, they're back. No, they're drowning again. And so on. It's a fun Haggadah for kids, or an engaging Haggadah, I think would be a fair way to say it. There are a number of different pop-ups throughout. But it still used the traditional text. And what is that traditional text? Well, it comes from a very old Haggadot. For example, this Haggadah, this Ashkenazi Haggadah, was from the mid-15th century. And you can actually see that the text itself is very similar to the text that we know today, the traditional Haggadah. Although this one is very ornate in its writing. There are bird's heads Haggadot. The bird's head Haggadot are those that are illustrated in many different ways, using bird's heads for people, because they didn't want to draw people just in case it seemed almost idolatrous. This Haggadah, the Venice Haggadah from 1609, and yes, in case you're wondering, I have a large collection of Haggadot. I find it fascinating. This Haggadah itself has much more text. This is this is a fascinating excerpt, actually, in the Haggadah because of the way the art is done. You may know this art, in fact. This is often quoted and used in various Haggadot. The images are used. And it's images where the Haggadot tend to vary. This Haggadah, which was given to me when I was a teenager, is actually a very interesting Haggadah. This one is about the story of Israel's liberation, and it leads all the way up to the founding of the State of Israel. It even has the Declaration of Independence at the back. And why do I mention this one? Because of this particular image of the 4 children, which you can see, where the evil son is an axe murderer, which is taking evil to a very different level, I would say. There are even modern Haggadot that use very different styles of design, of illustration. This is the Passover Haggadah graphic novel, which the Dinner Family edition, which came out a few years ago. So it's a translation not just into text, but into art itself. And of course, the family Passover Haggadah, the Prince of Egypt Haggadah. Many kids who have seen the Prince of Egypt have these images really burned into their minds in a positive way. And so this Haggadah uses the traditional text and adds the images from the movie around it. And so what's interesting is that we have many different Haggadot that tend to have the same text, but very little ritual creativity until the last 40 years or so. And that's where we've seen an explosion of different kinds of liturgy in the Haggadah. And it's very exciting to me that in the week before Pesach, I often get members who send me emails saying, here is the Haggadah that we're going to use in our family this year. And they have readings, extra insertions, and so on. And they work out, how do we follow the traditional order of the Seder in our own unique way that speaks to us, taking tradition and modernity, which is what Reformed Jews always do. And in fact, one of the readings that a member shared, I'm going to be sharing at our communal Seder on the second night of Pesach, because it's such a powerful, lovely, wonderful reading. And our communal Seder includes a ritual that I added as well, that I created about another cup, not just the cup for Elijah, and not just the cup for Miriam, which is a cup that many people have added to the Seder table. I add one more, and I explain why as well. And so I share all this to hope to share with you the inspiration, the idea that your Seder is up to you. We have a traditional form, a traditional structure, and there are traditional prayers that are recited, but you may wish to focus on different things. You may wish to bring in extra readings, extra poetry, extra illustrations, conversation. The idea of the Seder is for us to ask questions and for them to be answered, for us to relive the Exodus from Egypt. And so we have to make sure that we can relive it in a way that's meaningful to us. Because as much as I miss my grandparents, I don't totally miss the Seder that I had when I was a kid. I found it extremely dull and only looked forward really to the company and to Grandma's food. Because that Seder went on way too long for young children and it wasn't engaging. There are ways to engage children, there are ways to engage each other, there are ways to make the Seder our own. And so I'd love to know during Pesach, let me know. This year we tried this, we read this, we added this. I'd be really interested to know. And as we start to gather together liturgy from our members, written by our members, especially if you've written something, please let me know. I'd love to read it. I'd love to reflect on it. I'd love to talk about it. So please feel free to join us, of course. It's Shabbat. Feel free to join us for our Shabbat service. This evening, some of the music has a Pesach feel to it. Feel free to join us tomorrow morning. The Unsolved Mysteries of the Seder. In our Torah study, we look at the concept of teku, where the rabbis didn't know the answer to the question and left it for Elijah to resolve. And that affects our Seder in terms of how many cups of wine do we have. Do we have 4 cups of wine? Do we have 5 cups of wine? And why did that lead to a cup of Elijah? We'll be looking at some examples of teku, particularly relevant to Pesach. For example, if you, following on from last week, if you've cleared out your house of chametz and you see a mouse of one color come into your house with bread, and then you see a mouse of another color leave your house with a similar shaped piece of bread, do you assume that there is still chametz in your house, or do you assume that the second mouse removed it? And Talmud genuinely goes into a conversation about whether or not mice share bread with each other. And that may sound ridiculous, but it's really important actually, in terms of boundaries and in terms of how do we take care of the festival without becoming obsessive. And that's something we started to discuss last week. But now we move into the idea of what about the idea of not knowing the answer to a question? Because over 300 times in Talmud, the rabbis say teku, which means, we don't know the answer. We've reached a bit of a problem here because two totally appropriate perspectives disagree with each other. And so what does that mean for us as Jews and as human beings? What does it mean to not know the answer to a question? Or, even more than that, to know that the question cannot be answered by us? That's a really interesting thing. So I hope you join us for our Torah study tomorrow and, of course, also for our Shabbat Shacharit service. And I wish you a happy Pesach, a kosher Pesach, a liberating Pesach, a Pesach of freedom, a Pesach where you feel yourself liberated so that you can also, as much as possible, help all those who aren't liberated in this world today to be liberated. I wish you Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach.